Live from London, this is Global Business.
Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Jamie Owen.
And I'm Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. The European Union imposes its first sanctions on Russian gas as part of the latest move to restrict Moscow's exports.
Our other headlines, you're in the red. 8 European Union countries are given a formal warning over their high budget deficits.
Electric vehicle sales in the European Union fall 12% in May after big declines in the biggest market, Germany.
The number of people displaced by war, climate change and famine reaches a record 120 million. We'll be marking World Refugee Day.
And stronger action needed on climate change. The United Nations says 80% of us want our governments to do more.
The European Union has imposed sanctions on Russian gas for the first time in its latest response to the conflict in Ukraine. Russian exporters will be banned from using European ports to transfer liquefied natural gas for exporting to third countries.
European financing for new Russian LNG terminals will also be blocked. But the announcement stops far short of a complete ban. Gas will continue to flow through pipes to some EU countries.
Angelos Koutsis is from Bond Beta Liefmeier, a Belgium-based environmental NGO. Angelos, good to see you. Are sanctions ever effective?
Sanctions can definitely be effective, especially the sanction that is now being approved or will be officially approved next Monday on transshipment, because Russian Arctic LNG is not like common LNG. It has one problem, and that is its access to global markets. And it's dependent on transshipment services in the EU to access global markets. So with this sanction, we would basically be cutting them off almost entirely from access to global markets.
Just to be clear, these sanctions will stop short, though, won't they, of a full ban on EU countries purchasing Russian LNG. Is that not the case? And if so, why?
No, you're completely right. It's not a full Russian LNG ban. If we look at the numbers, you can divide the Russian LNG flow to Europe into categories. Russian LNG that's being imported by the EU, that's about 75% of the LNG that's coming to our ports. And the other 25% is being transshipped to mostly non-EU markets. And the reason why probably they didn't address a full Russian LNG ban is because the Ukrainian transit pipeline, which imports Russian pipeline gas, it will be cut off starting 2025. And it seems to me that EU leaders are playing it safe and are awaiting next winter how they come out of it to start discussing a full Russian LNG ban.
Well, that must be a very serious concern for governments in Europe, because given those concerns about the EU running out of gas and the need to try and meet storage targets, how will these sanctions affect the EU's energy security, especially this winter?
Yeah, so the EU sanction on transshipment ban will basically have almost no impact on EU's security of supply. As I mentioned before, about 90% of the transshipped Russian LNG volumes don't go to the EU itself, but go to other markets around the globe. So actually they represent only 0.3% of the total EU gas demand. So that's very negligible. If we make a comparison, if you have a hot or cold winter, that changes the gas demand with 5%. So it's a marginal effect, if we could say so.
Marginal or otherwise, if the LNG isn't coming from Russia, what are the alternatives for the EU to replace it?
Well, actually, as mentioned before, this transshipped LNG, the EU doesn't necessarily need it. It's just let's say, a favor that we're doing for Moscow to help them have access to global markets. And today, the EU decided to stop doing that favor for Moscow. But also, generally speaking, if we look at the numbers, we see that the EU has been quite successful in drastically reducing their gas demand since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia. So most of the LNG that's been cut off, or the Russian gas imports that have been cut off, were not replaced by diversification, but most of it was actually replaced by energy efficiency measures and investment in renewable energies.
Angelos, good to see you. Thank you very much indeed for your time. Angelos Koutsis from Bond Beta Liefmeier.
You're overdrawn and in the red. The European Commission has formally warned 8 member states, including France and Italy, over their excessive budget deficits. France had a debt level of 109% of GDP in 2023, while Italy's was 138%. Belgium, Hungary, Malta, Poland and Slovakia are also in the spotlight for spending too much. They're still suffering the after effects of the COVID pandemic and the spike in energy prices. The rebuke comes at a sensitive time for France, which is heading towards elections. Whoever forms the next government is likely to face severe spending constraints. Well, let's talk to our correspondent Ross Cullen in Paris. Ross, why has the Commission taken this step now?
Hi, Robin. We've heard from the EU Commissioner Valdis Dombrovskis, who said, quote, well, long-standing structural challenges are holding back the EU's competitiveness. We look forward to receiving national fiscal structural plans from member states, including France and Italy, as you point out, that bring down debt and deficit and reflect recommendations. It really is important for the EU that, where possible, its member states do try to follow fiscal rules, do try to exercise fiscal responsibility. There are always problems about overspending, underspending, and trying to corral all the different member states, all 27 of them, to make sure that they are following the rules. We do know that they have said that the fiscal rules that they have set out many years ago, when they brought in the single currency as well, that there shouldn't be an imbalance in national fiscal positions. Greater than 3% of GDP. Try to bring debt as well below 60%. You point out France is way above that, way over 100%. And so they've brought in these recommendations for these member states, including France, to try to ensure that there is better fiscal responsibility in these states going forward.
France, of course, holding an election very soon. Is this going to affect the campaign?
Well, we have heard from the French finance minister saying that if the National Rally, France's leading far-right party, who are leading the polls, notably Marine Le Pen, the most recognisable figurehead in that party, France's finance minister saying that if they were to win power, get the greatest number of seats and start to implement their economic programme, France could have a Liz Truss-style event. We do remember infamously the Prime Minister in the UK in 2022. She was only in power for 49 days. Her and her Chancellor at the time, Kwasi Kwarteng, brought in this budget giveaway with what was contained in that budget was so unnerving to the markets that there was a potential crash coming to the British economy. There was such a reaction from the markets, from the banks, about what they believed was the unfunded nature of that British budget, that it did actually presage the end of the Liz Truss government, and she stepped down. France's finance minister saying we could see something like that if the National Rally get in and start implementing their programme. They want to repeal France's pension reform legislation, bring the retirement age back from 64 to 62. You might remember all the riots and the tension last year when that was forced through Parliament. They also want to cancel income tax if you are under 30. And so they have this big working population of the under 30s not paying income tax. Then people will be able to retire at 62. They say, the National Rally, though, don't worry, this will be entirely costed. This will be entirely funded. And I've been speaking to a National Rally prospective MP who says that we will be able to fund this by cutting down on the immigration services that we are supplying inside France, and also by chopping $2 billion off the amount that France sends to the European Union budget. So again, a lot of tension when it comes to that possible relationship between Brussels and Paris if the Eurosceptic far-right National Rally were to win the elections, which get underway with the first round on the 30th of June.
Ross, thank you very much. Our correspondent Ross Cullen in Paris. Bank of England has kept interest rates on hold at 5.25%. The governor said it was too early to cut rates, despite figures out this week showing that inflation is back down at the bank's target of 2%. The country is preparing to vote in a general election on the 4th of July, but the bank said that had no impact on its decision.
The UK supermarket giant Sainsbury's will sell its banking business to NatWest, with the transfer expected in the first half of next year. The high street lender will gain around 1 million new accounts, with an expected $3 billion in customer assets. Sainsbury's announced that it would wind down its banking division earlier this year.
Global leaders and health groups have gathered in Paris to launch a $1.2 billion scheme to increase vaccine production in Africa. The European-funded initiative aims for the world's poorest continent to manufacture at least 60% of its required vaccine doses by 2040. It comes after the COVID pandemic exposed extreme inequalities in international vaccine distribution.
Electric vehicle sales in the European Union fell 12% in May, following big declines in the EU's biggest market, Germany. Our correspondent Trent Murray is in Berlin. Trent, well, really a significant drop in sales. Just talk us through these numbers.
Yeah, that's right, Jamie. It is 12% down across the 27 members of the European Union, but very much being dragged down by what's happening here in Germany. As you say, by far the biggest vehicle market within the EU. Sales down here some 30%. Now, what the industry is saying is that is largely due to the fact that the German government scrapped some quite generous subsidies at the end of last year. That is cooling consumer appetite somewhat when it comes to electric vehicle sales. But nevertheless, it is a concern, I think, for the industry, which is really throwing everything at sort of electric vehicle strategies and the future being fully battery powered. What we know, of course, is that this comes at a time where the economic situation does remain problematic, to say the least. Consumer spending is down, largely due to high inflation, and so the industry is quite concerned now to start to see sales being impacted and what that could mean for their strategies, as I say, as they move away from combustion engines. I think what won't help that uncertainty in the industry, of course, is that new EU announcement that we heard recently, that they would implement around a 38% provisional tariff on vehicles made in China. That will include electric vehicles from Tesla, which are made at their Shanghai factory and then exported here to Europe. Already, Tesla founder Elon Musk has said for that reason prices will have to increase on his vehicles. So that will add to, I think, the uncertainty, as I say. One interesting piece of data within this new report concerns hybrid sales versus battery electric. Now, what we are seeing is that 100% electric vehicles are down in terms of their sales, but where there has been a slight uptick has been on hybrids, cars that use basically petrol and battery in order to drive. I think that probably stems from the fact that many auto groups and consumers have said Europe's charging network is just not extensive enough yet. That is adding to buyers' concerns when it comes to whether to fully throw their weight behind getting an electric vehicle. Seemingly, these figures tell us that people are still somewhat hedging their bets, and they want to have that that petrol backup, I should say, in case they can't find a charging station.
It's the big picture stuff. Can we just drill down into one car maker in particular and the story making the headlines there, certainly in the motoring press, about BMW and a bit of a blow for BMW's battery ambitions. What's this all about?
Yeah, that's right. A pretty significant story, I have to say. BMW, we are hearing in the past few hours, according to Handelsblatt, which is one of the most sort of reputable financial newspapers in the German-speaking world, they are reporting that BMW has withdrawn a $2 billion order from Swedish battery maker Northvolt. Now, Northvolt may not be necessarily a household name, but they certainly are a big player in European battery manufacturing. In fact, we saw earlier this year Chancellor Scholz himself here in Germany groundbreaking a new factory for this Swedish company. It was very much hoped that they were going to be a crucial piece of the puzzle for Europe to try and have its made in Europe battery sector thriving versus importing batteries from other parts of the world. Well, nevertheless, it would seem today that the deal has somewhat gone belly up for BMW. They've now withdrawn that deal because they say that the Swedish company just cannot make the batteries fast enough. They were expected to start rolling batteries off their factory line from next year for BMW. The company is saying they're going to ask the Swedes to focus instead on the next generation of batteries. But nevertheless, this will be a big blow for the Swedish company. We are hearing BMW is now looking to South Korea to try and fill what's been lost effectively from this order. But it does sort of raise questions around whether European supply chains are ready to do a lot of the heavy lifting for their own battery manufacturing. It would seem today that Made in Europe strategy has been dealt a pretty significant blow by two of the biggest players in this space, effectively tearing up that $2 billion contract.
Trent, thank you for that. Our correspondent Trent Murray in Berlin.
China says the European Commission has demanded an unprecedented amount of detailed information from Chinese car makers in its anti-dumping investigation. The Ministry of Commerce argues the move undermines fair competition and violates WTO rules. The EU is considering raising tariffs on Chinese EVs, with the investigation requiring details on raw materials, production costs, pricing and sales channels.
Hungary's government says EU tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles go against market competition. It's hoping to play a role in trying to resolve this dispute when it takes over the rotating EU presidency in July. Our correspondent Pablo Gutierrez reports.
Chinese-made electric vehicles face a potential roadblock in Europe. The EU claims tariffs would protect European car manufacturers from alleged unfair competition. However, there's disagreement over whether this is the right path for the bloc.
Protectionism instead of cooperation is not the right way to go.
Starting in July, the EU's additional tariffs on some Chinese electric vehicle brands could reach up to 38.1%. To avoid these additional duties, analysts say Chinese automakers could follow the lead of BYD, which is constructing its first European EV manufacturing plant in Hungary. However, this strategy is not straightforward.
That according to the European customs regulation, a product is EU-made if the spare parts and components are at least 52% of the total value.
Chinese EV makers currently have an 8% share of the EU market, up from under 1% in 2019, and this could rise to 15% by next year. Analysts say prices typically 20% less than EU manufactured models have accelerated their market growth.
These kind of tariffs have never helped in the past to develop those industries that it is here to protect. So in my opinion, it's just gonna slow down the development of these European firms.
In 2023, China and the EU maintained their status as each other's second largest trading partners, with a combined trade reaching $783 billion.
Hungary has criticized the EU tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, advocating for cooperation and free competition instead. On July 1st, Hungary is set to take over the rotating presidency of the European Union, at which point it plans to introduce a series of measures to promote EV adoption in Europe.
Hungary's plan includes a new EU incentive program to boost electric vehicle adoption among consumers and new standards to enhance the competitiveness of European EV makers.
During this presidency, maybe we can tell everybody that what is the main focus and main idea of the Hungarian government. We want connectivity, we want to throw away this kind of sanctioning policy.
Some experts say it's not too late for the EU to step on the brakes and avoid a full trade conflict with China. Pablo Gutierrez, CGTN, Budapest.
A group of TikTok creators has filed legal action to block a new US law that could ban the app used by 170 million Americans. They must submit their legal briefs by Thursday. Our correspondent John Terrett is in New York. So, John, a looming deadline for TikTok.
It surely is. As you know, I'm a big fan of TikTok. I used to watch the best of Jamie Owen videos on my way in the train in the morning, and now I'm just addicted to TikTok. It's absolutely great. I love it. I'm a big fan, and lots of Americans are as well. 170 million of us in this country are on TikTok as regular users. Now, the thing is, TikTok faces a ban in the United States, as you know. And I think that kicks in December now. I believe we actually have a date now. And it will be banned here if it isn't divested from ByteDance. Now, ByteDance is the sort of company that owns TikTok, really. And it's rather lazy of me, I understand, I know, but I always just say, you know, TikTok owned by ByteDance. And it sort of is, but it's important, I think, to point out that ByteDance and TikTok both say look, you know, 60% of our company at ByteDance is owned by overseas investors, including Americans, and then 20% by the founders of the company and 20% by the staff. So having said that, it's still worth bearing in mind that ByteDance is really in control of TikTok, as it were. And what rattles Americans is the fact that under the laws, if Beijing government asks ByteDance to come up with any data that they want to see, they have to provide it, you see. And that's the thing that Americans don't like, and that's why they want TikTok divested from ByteDance. So the thing is, ByteDance and TikTok are suing the administration here under the First Amendment, which is the free speech amendment. Americans are more or less entitled to say almost anything without worry about legal recourse. And so under that, they're going after the US administration over this ban. But as you rightly say, a group of TikTok users are also getting involved as well. And the deadline for their lawyers to submit all the legal documentation for that case to go ahead is today, Thursday. So they better get a crack on there. Now, the irony of all this is that TikTok is not based in Beijing. It is based in Los Angeles and also in Singapore. And that is why Xu Chu, who's the boss of TikTok, when he appears on Capitol Hill, when he's grilled by senators and Congress people, they always say to him, "You've got a Chinese passport, haven't you? You must have a Chinese visa." No, I'm from Singapore. I've got a Singapore passport. Now, the other thing I think is worth mentioning is we just hear on the grapevine that TikTok may be developing its own algorithm for the United States only. This may or may not help. ByteDance has said they will not divest themselves of TikTok. But one of the things that we know, should they change their mind, and there are American entrepreneurs lining up to snap the company up with its 170 million users, should they change their mind before December, they will never give them the algorithm. So the American entrepreneurs, should they buy it, will get the name, probably, they'll get the user base and all that kind of stuff, but they won't get the algorithm. So the fact that TikTok is apparently designing its own US algorithm, I think, is interesting. It certainly is a story that won't lie down here, but at the moment, ByteDance says we have no plans to divest ourselves of TikTok.
Well, John, you talked about being grilled by US Congress. Earlier this week, we've been talking about the CEO of Boeing being grilled by Congress, and now the families of the victims of some of those people killed in 2 Boeing crashes have been speaking up.
I know. Boeing is a company that simply can't get out in front of itself. It keeps tripping over itself. Everywhere it turns, there is a problem. And the latest news here is that the families of those who died in the Lion Air crash in 2018 and the Ethiopian crash in 2019 are literally not holding back. They're not pulling any punches. They have said that this was the darkest and deadliest corporate crime in US history. That's quite something, isn't it? When you think of all the things that have been done in the name of US corporations over the years, they say this is the deadliest corporate crime in US history. And of course it revolves around software that Boeing installed on the new 737 Maxes, but they didn't tell the pilots it was there. And the software kicked in and the planes crashed because the pilots didn't know what was going on. So the families are now seeking $24 billion. That's the maximum amount. And basically, here in America, the DOJ did prosecute Boeing back in 2021, but there was a clause in that that said the management could never be prosecuted. Well, now the Department of Justice is saying, look, recent things that have happened regarding Boeing aircraft, particularly the Alaska door blowout in January, have made that deal, basically the lapses and mishaps that have happened, have voided that deal. And so now the families are calling for aggressive criminal prosecution of Dennis Muhlenberg, the former CEO, and I assume, they don't say this, but I assume David Calhoun, who is the current CEO. And basically, one thing you probably don't know is that the fines that Boeing has been fined so far, some of them have been written off to tax. Yeah, I know. We know that because Josh Hawley, who's a Republican senator from Missouri, said so in the hearing with David Calhoun just 2 days ago on Tuesday. Calhoun famously, you remember, stood up and faced the families, took responsibility for the Lion Air crash and the Ethiopian crash, and apologized for it. He also said the culture in the company is far from perfect and that something's wrong when it comes to the way they deal with whistleblowers. So this story continues here. Boeing shares are down almost 1% now and 31% in the year to date.
John, thank you very much. Our correspondent John Terrett in New York.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead. Hamas cannot be eliminated. Israel's military spokesperson appears to question Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's strategy on Gaza.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and a bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans? Grey rhinos? And unicorn companies? Make sense of it all with Global Business, only on CGTN.
I think it should be more global cooperation.
I would like to hear more the voice of the developing countries.
Globalization has lifted more than 1 billion people out of poverty.
The green transition has to happen. It's a necessity.
Well, China and the United States are important powers in the world.
What unites us is much more than what divides us.
And I believe China is committed to this agenda.
Join me, Juliette Mann, to set the agenda at these times every weekend on CGTN.
Events have consequences. Words create impact.
One more offensive in a long line of battles that's been ongoing for more...
Just got to be careful here with some gunshots. Excuse us.
The world today matters for your world tomorrow.
The number of casualties is growing quickly.
Why, this is one of the hardest hit towns in the region.
The world today, every day on CGTN.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe. Israel's top military spokesperson has appeared to contradict Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's government, saying it will be impossible to destroy Hamas.
In what appears to be a deepening rift between the country's army and political leadership, Daniel Hagari told Israeli television that trying to eliminate the group was like throwing sand in the eyes of the public. He said Hamas was an idea which was rooted in people's hearts.
Let's talk to our correspondent, Sarah Coates, who's in Tel Aviv. So, Sarah, how significant are these remarks?
Hello there, Robin. Very significant, really underscoring the growing frustration, the growing concern among Israeli and also US officials over what is seen as really a lack of a plan for the day after in Gaza, and also what is currently happening in the Strip. We also do need to remember very similar comments from the Defence Minister Yoav Gallant about a month ago. He came out to say that Netanyahu's inaction on a plan is pushing Israel toward having to impose military and civilian control in Gaza. Now, just a few days ago, this is really being brought back into context now. It was the only centrist power in the coalition, Benny Gantz. He withdrew from that very limited war cabinet, citing the exact same thing, the lack of a post-war plan. And what this has really done now is put Netanyahu under even more pressure, put him in an even more dangerous position, given that he now has to rely on these very far right-wing elements of his government, specifically the National Security Minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir, and also the Finance Minister, Bezalel Smotrich. Now, these are people who we do need to remember have been openly pushing for the resettlement of Gaza, trying to get more illegal settlements pushed through in the West Bank. And this is certainly of major concern to international partners like the United States, something that the US has been coming out time and time again saying it simply will not accept and must be stopped, really, to give Israel the security that it needs. So certainly a lot of pressure here on Netanyahu, not just these divisions between the military and himself, himself, but also within the coalition. And we cannot forget what is currently happening on the Israeli street. Demonstrations really happening on a daily basis now. You have anti-government protesters. They are calling for snap elections. They are calling for Benjamin Netanyahu to step down before October 7. And they're also calling for the immediate release of these hostages. They're calling for Benjamin Netanyahu to cut a deal with Hamas to get these remaining 116 people out of the Gaza Strip who've been held there for some 9 months now. So certainly a very, very difficult position for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And really, these comments are becoming much more frequent.
Sarah, thank you very much. Our correspondent Sarah Coates in Tel Aviv.
Well, Hezbollah's leader has issued a stern warning threatening a war with no restraint and no rules if Israel launches a major offence against the group in Lebanon. Hassan Nasrallah also threatened to attack Cyprus if it assists Israel.
Cyprus should be warned that opening Cypriot bases and airports to the Israelis to target Lebanon means that the Cypriot government has become part of the war, and the resistance will deal with it, as it is part of the war.
The Associated Press reporter Karim Shurhayeb is in Beirut.
At the moment, things are continuing as they have been for months. Hezbollah are launching attacks into northern Israel, and Israel is doing the same into Lebanon. What we do know for sure is that tensions are at an all-time high since the month-long conflict start. And in recent weeks, we have witnessed unprecedented escalations from both Hezbollah and the Israeli military. And they're both sending a clear message. Not only are they ready for war, but they're both capable of inflicting severe damage to each other. And these developments come right after U.S. senior envoy Amos Hochstein's latest round of shuttle diplomacy with Lebanese and Israeli officials to try to restore calm and to prevent this conflict from turning into an all-out war. The great concern is that he sent a message saying time is running out, though a diplomatic solution is still possible. And the greatest fear is that this war will turn regional. This is not just about Lebanon. Hezbollah, alongside with other Iran-backed allies, notably the Yemen's Houthi rebel group, Iraqi militias, have been involved in this conflict. And they're saying that they're playing a supporting role, hoping for a ceasefire in Gaza, to play a pressure role. That being said, the fear is that if all-out war happens, there could be a direct confrontation with Iran as well. Iran has been quiet thus far, supporting a ceasefire in Gaza and its group's efforts, its allied group's efforts in the region. But we did see a glimpse of what this confrontation could look like. And so now it is a race against time and a diplomatic scramble. The U.S. is now hoping that a Gaza ceasefire would translate into calm in Lebanon, but it's just a matter of time and whether we will see something in Gaza translate into the rest of the region.
Israeli airstrikes have continued to target large refugee camps in central Gaza. Further south, more Palestinians are fleeing Rafah as tanks advance into the city. From Gaza, our correspondent Akram Al-Satari reports.
Well, the fighting continues to intensify as the Israeli occupation forces have been targeting 2 or 3 main areas in the Gaza Strip, one of which is the Gaza city, where in a Zaytun neighborhood there were some bombardments and around 3 people were killed and 8 others were injured. And Nusayrat, also in the Gaza central area, witnessed an aerial strike that took the lives of 8 Palestinians and injured around 15. In Rafah also there was some heavy bombardment in Rafah, in Al-Shabura in particular, where the Hamas brigades have been facing the Israeli army and have been causing some fatalities and injuries among those soldiers who are deployed into Al-Shabura area in central Rafah city. According to a statement that was made by Hamas military wing, they have targeted 4 different armored vehicles in Al-Shabura area, which is the most overcrowded neighborhood in Rafah, if not in the whole Gaza Strip. They said they have managed to kill and injure several Israeli soldiers, and they said also they saw the Israeli helicopters landing in some areas nearby the incident scene, and that they were evacuating the Israeli soldiers who were killed and injured. Also, the Palestinian Ministry of Health stated today that 35 people were killed in the last 24 hours and around 130 others were injured because of the Israeli ongoing bombardment. The news also about the Israeli occupation targeting people who were waiting for the humanitarian aid convoy and for people who are also securing those humanitarian aid convoys. People have been talking about the hunger that has befell the Gaza Strip. People have been talking the risks associated to that kind of siege and denial of the very basic right of having access to food. And people have also been seeing the repercussion of that in the form of the scarcity of the food supplies and food items in the different parts of the Gaza Strip. The children dying because of that, and larger number of people resorting to very negative coping mechanisms, trying to serve themselves and serve their families any type of food. So the situation continues to be extremely dire. The bombardment is still continuous in Gaza City, Gaza Central area and Rafah. And in Rafah, the fire exchange is reaching a heavy level, and there seems to be losses from both sides that have been increasing due to that ongoing exchange of fire.
There are now a record number of people across the world who are displaced from home. It's World Refugee Day, so perhaps a chance to look at some of those numbers. By the end of April this year, the United Nations estimates more than 120 million people have fled their homes due to persecution, war, climate events and human rights violations. This equates to 1 in every 69 people being forcefully displaced, a ratio that's been rising for 12 years or so, roughly doubling over the past decade. Around 47 million, or 40% of that figure, are children. Well, these figures have been exacerbated by outbreaks of violence, including those in Sudan and Gaza, along with longer-standing conflicts or instability in Afghanistan, Syria, Myanmar, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Venezuela, and, of course, Ukraine. Matthew Saltmarsh is from the United Nations Refugee Agency.
There are very few regions that are untouched here, but, of course, you know, in the last year or so, the situation in Sudan has been particularly preoccupying. Over 10 million people displaced from Sudan, a bitter conflict that is causing huge bloodshed, instability, displacement, particularly in Darfur, but also across the borders around that region. But it's not just in Sudan. I mean, if you look to Ukraine, the war is still rumbling on there. You are seeing some fresh displacement of Ukrainians away from the front line and some movement within the country. But also there are, as you mentioned, long-standing, what we call protracted conflicts. Now, these sometimes blow hot and cold, but the instability and the lack of security in many of these places means that it is difficult, if not impossible, for people to return home sustainably. And we're thinking of places like in particular of the Afghans who have been displaced in Pakistan and in Iran and in Latin America. You could look at places like Venezuela. And then going to Asia, you can look at the situation in Myanmar. So really, across the globe, we have situations which are causing displacement, and we have a precious few solutions to them coming to the fore.
Refugees are too often dependent on the kindness of strangers. I wonder how you'd assess the level of international attention and assistance.
Well, it's been worryingly thin, to be honest. If we go back a couple of years after the Ukraine war broke out, there was an outpouring of goodwill and aid as well towards those who were displaced. We at UNHCR got a record level of donations from the private sector for that conflict. Now, however, that war has gone out of the headlines. The Sudan war has always struggled to get into the headlines. And when you look at our levels of funding in some of these situations, both in Ukraine and in Sudan, it's hovering around the 20% mark. And that means we simply don't have enough money, we simply don't have enough resources to be able to do what we desperately need to do to be able to help those people who have been so badly affected by these conflicts. But it's not just those. If you look all around the world, Africa, as I said, Latin America, into Asia, we are struggling to get enough funding to be able to provide the cash-based assistance, to be able to provide the shelter, the medical support, the food, the real basics that those who are displaced need.
Many of these people head to Europe in search of hope. Some very disturbing reports in Europe suggesting some displaced people are even thrown overboard to their deaths or pushed back into the sea. What's the UN's response on this?
Well, those reports are extremely worrying and extremely disturbing and very serious. We have, for a long time, been raising the alarm about pushbacks from Europe. Greece is one country, it's not the only one, but there have been a number of incidents reported from Greece. We've been collating that data and forwarding it to the authorities for official investigations. We think it's important that those investigations are independent and that they now make progress because, as you mentioned, the most recent reports are particularly worrying in that regard.
The latest EU election results demonstrate Europe leaning increasingly towards the right. How concerned are you about the growing anti-immigration and anti-migrant agenda?
The right wing, the populists, have been scapegoating refugees and migrants. They have been blaming them for many of the ills in society, whether that's economic ills or other instability. Obviously, we think that's greatly exaggerated and very unfair. At the moment, as you said, the EU does seem to have shifted right. However, the EU does have a migration and asylum agreement, a compact, whereby the different states have agreed to what could potentially be a better management of new arrivals. So we're ready to support the EU with that, and we'll continue doing so.
Kenya hosts an estimated 750,000 refugees from over 20 countries, with the majority having fled conflicts in Somalia, South Sudan and the DRC.
The country is trying to provide refugees with access to better facilities. The policy change is being welcomed by one couple who've had to make big sacrifices to be together. Our correspondent Daniel Arap Moy reports.
Abudia Ikwan fled the turmoil over homeland Somalia, finding refuge in Kenya. She arrived in the Dadaab camp with little more than the clothes on her back and memories of her homeland. Despite the challenges, Abudia quickly settled down and even met a man from the host community.
When I met her, she told me she did not have a husband, so I made a move. And since that day, I have been the happiest man alive.
Abdia and her son would go on to get married, exchanging their vows 3 years ago.
What makes the love between Hassan and Abdia remarkable is how their love has blossomed over time, thriving on mutual respect, trust and support.
When Hassan came into my life, everything changed. He offered me support and a love I had never known before. He didn't see me as a refugee, but as a person with hopes and dreams.
However, their journey towards social inclusion remains fraught with challenges. While the local community, initially skeptical, has gradually embraced their relationship. Under current regulations, the husband of a female refugee is obligated to reside within the Dadaab camp. The policy is designed to ensure the safety of refugees, but the couple argue that their situation needs special attention. Despite this hiccup, going from strangers in troubled times to partners in love and life, their story continues to inspire many around them. Daniel Arap Moy, CGTN, Dadaab, Kenya.
You can get highlights from the week's news in Europe and China direct to your inbox from CGTN's Storyboard email newsletter. Sign up at europe.cgtn.com/newsletter.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead. China and Malaysia agree to extend visa-free travel as the Chinese Premier concludes his visit to Kuala Lumpur.
Hello, welcome back to Global Business Europe with Jamie Owen and Robin Dwyer. Our top stories: the European Union imposes its first sanctions on Russian gas as part of its latest move to try to restrict Moscow's exports.
8 European Union countries are given a formal warning by Brussels over their high budget deficits.
And electric vehicle sales in the European Union fall 12% in May following big declines in the biggest market, Germany.
China and Malaysia have agreed to extend visa-free travel for people in both countries. A joint statement was released as Chinese Premier Li Qiang concluded his visit to Malaysia.
Under this agreement, Malaysian travellers will be allowed to enter China without a visa until the end of 2025, while Chinese tourists can enter Malaysia visa-free until the end of 2026. Our correspondent Ryan Meltzer reports now from Kuala Lumpur.
Today, the business continued with a working luncheon with business leaders from both countries, speeches by both leaders, and a signing of a number of memorandums of understanding. Yesterday, a number of memorandums of understanding was signed between government to government, basically, on increasing cooperation in numerous areas: green technology, digital economy, higher education, science and technology, even tourism and agriculture. Today, there were more MOUs signed between government agencies and also between private businesses looking to boost investment between the two countries. And then when all the meetings had wrapped up, they issued a 15-page joint statement, which is absolutely unprecedented for a bilateral visit of this sort. You might get a scant 1- or 2-page statement, but I think it underlines how much they had intended to achieve during this visit and how much they're laying the groundwork for the future, for the next 50 years, building on the comprehensive strategic partnership, which is now 11 years old between the country, and building what President Xi has called the China-Malaysia community for a shared future. From the leadership and from the people here, there's a bit of a sense of being flattered by the attention that China seems to heap on Malaysia, the attention that it pays to this country, given that Malaysia is a middling power, only 30 million people, albeit an important trading country. However, it seems that China does pay disproportionate attention to this country. It seems to really value the relationship with the people of this country, not only seeking to improve investment and people-to-people relations and build on centuries of cultural ties, but really to take this relationship forward further.
Outgoing Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte will be the next NATO Secretary-General. All 32 members of the alliance have agreed that Rutte will succeed the current head, Jens Stoltenberg. It comes after Hungary and Slovakia dropped their opposition and Romania withdrew its candidacy. Rutte will take over at the beginning of October, a month before the US election. Former US President Donald Trump, the Republican candidate, has pledged to stay in NATO, but threatens to cut US aid to Ukraine if he's re-elected.
Poland's President Duda will make a state visit to China from the 22nd of June. China's foreign ministry says he'll meet President Xi Jinping and sign agreements on trade and travel. The visit coincides with the 75th anniversary of diplomatic relations between Poland and China.
Russia's president has arrived in Vietnam on the final stop of his visit to Asia. Vladimir Putin's pledged to strengthen what he calls a comprehensive strategic partnership between Russia and Vietnam. Moscow says his talks with the country's leaders in Hanoi will focus on trade and technology, as well as regional and international issues.
China and the United States have held talks on the international narcotics trade. The White House has described the joint action as a significant step in the fight against fentanyl. It's been a major cause of death in the U.S. Chinese officials pointed to advances in anti-drug cooperation with Washington this year.
Tear gas and water cannon have been used by Kenyan police to disperse protesters in Nairobi. It comes amid widespread demonstrations over a controversial bill to raise taxes on basic goods. The government's already backed down over some of the measures, including a 16% tax on bread. The death toll during this year's Hajj pilgrimage in Mecca is believed to now be over 1,000 people, as an intense heat wave has seen temperatures exceed 50 degrees. Well, let's talk to our correspondent Adel El-Marouki, who's in Egypt. Adel, what more can you tell us?
Well, basically it comes as a massive heat wave hit the region, reaching up to 51.8 degrees. That's the highest registered during the Hajj week. Now, Hajj is a once-in-a-lifetime ritual for Muslims to perform in their lifetime, and basically there's only a limited number of tickets for the more than 1.5 billion pilgrims there, which leads to several ways for people to try to reach the Hajj unofficially, basically. So, for example, in Egypt, where the numbers, so far we're waiting for official numbers from the Egyptian side and Saudi Arabia specifically when the season completes. But just to put in perspective, what we're getting from unofficial reports now is that Egypt alone is now at 1,000, which puts the entire amount of pilgrims who have died this year way past the 1,000. We are getting already more than 300 from Indonesia, 40 or so from Jordan, and that's more or less the major figures coming out. To put it into relationship, we're talking about, in comparison, last year only 200 were reported. Now, because of these, for Egypt, for example, most of the 1,000 who have so far been reportedly dead because of the heat wave, heat strokes mainly, most of them, according to an unnamed Egyptian diplomat, were pilgrims who went to the Hajj unofficially, meaning they joined the rituals without issuing a Hajj visa, which means that they don't get the government warnings, they don't get the location and updates of the medical facilities around them, and more importantly, basically, these are people who are trying to run away from the authorities and not go for help seeking them, because if they get caught, they will be breaking the law. And that basically sums up what exactly challenges have been there. Saudi Arabia says it has been warning about illegal pilgrims for quite a time, especially this season. Egypt is still looking for dozens who are still missing, not confirmed dead or even found their whereabouts. And just less than an hour ago, the Egyptian President El-Sisi said that an emergency committee had been set up to work 24/7 to try to allocate those missings and try to rally up the figures. So in general, it's a challenging task when you have about 1.8 million pilgrims all around, and with the record heat registered this week during the Hajj pilgrimage, which, as I told you earlier, about the maximum was 51.8 degrees. That's massive, and many times during the Hajj rituals, people will be exposed directly to the sun. So still, official figures are yet to confirm the exact number of the casualties, but has been growing just compared to the past 2 days. Yesterday, we were talking about 570. Today, 1,000 Egyptians only. And the rest, of course, of the countries, mainly Indonesia and Jordan, follows in terms of the number of casualties.
Adel El-Marouki in Egypt, thank you very much.
Firefighters tackling blazes near Athens say they suspect arsonists may have been involved. Dozens of people have fled their homes around the Greek capital as the flames advanced on residential areas. Helicopters, firefighting planes and fire engines have all been dispatched. The Chinese city of Guilin has been hit by the worst flooding since the year 1958. Villagers are trapped in their homes, shops are underwater, and railway services are suspended as heavy rain continues to batter the country's southern provinces. Over 1,000 people have been moved to safety, while many others still remain trapped.
4 out of 5 people want their governments to take more action on climate change. A United Nations survey shows most people support a quick transition from fossil fuels to clean energy, with only 7% opposing. More than 50% of respondents reported high levels of climate anxiety, particularly those in poorer parts of the world. It's the biggest poll ever carried out on the subject, involving 75,000 people in 77 countries.
Well, all this comes as greenhouse gas emissions and fossil fuel use hit an all-time high in 2023. An energy industry report says the increase was driven by growth in emerging economies, but that coal burning had fallen in developed countries. It says renewables are on the rise, accounting for nearly 15% of all global energy use.
Europe's largest energy expo has opened in Munich with the focus on renewables. Our correspondent Natalie Carney reports.
Over 3,000 exhibitors from all corners of the world are presenting their latest products and solutions in solar panels, e-mobility and energy storage. Close to 540 gigawatts of renewable energy capacity was installed worldwide last year, mostly consisting of solar panels. The industry leader in photovoltaic solutions is the Chinese company Longyi Green Energy Technology. The company says its full-size tandem solar cells have unprecedented levels of product efficiency. With its so-called back contact technology, it's been hailed as heralding a new era for the solar industry.
It is currently the highest efficiency among all the commercialized panels, and it's a big leap. And also, together with not only just the efficiency, but we achieved much better on degradation, on reliability, and also we have applied a lot of AI technology for the manufacturing side, so the reliability, the quality of the new BC panel is going to reach a new level.
Energy infrastructure in all areas of solar, wind, geothermal and hydro production is being rapidly expanded and being made more adaptable. According to the International Energy Agency, renewable energy will surpass coal power by 2025, and together with nuclear energy is expected to account for nearly half of the world's power generation by 2026.
Well, China is leading the way in renewable production and capacity. Globally, the momentum in this energy transition away from fossil fuels is slowing down, resulting in the inability of clean, green energy meeting our increasing global demands.
Economic volatility, heightened geopolitical tensions, and technological shifts have all had an impact, complicating the speed and trajectory of the energy transition. Some are calling for governments to work harder to create better market conditions for renewables.
There is encouraging messages because the technology is there, so we know that we need to deploy, but the state is actually really critical. Fossil fuel is still subsidized, $11 million per minute, and this is very clearly not creating the right environment, basically, for renewable energy to be competitive here. And governments focus very much on the power sector, but power is actually only covering 23% of the energy demand. So most is used as heat and as fuels. And here we clearly see that there is not the right policy attention.
According to REN 21, the global share of renewables being used to generate power is over 30%. Whereas in heat, it's only 10% and in fuels, 3%. It's scientifically possible to produce all the energy the world needs using renewables, but hurdles remain if net zero emission targets are to be met by 2050.
When we're looking in 2022, these are numbers, is 2.6% of global GDP went into security and only 0.6% into renewable uptake. Governments need to acknowledge that energy security and security go hand in hand.
We are willing to cooperate with any country, any regions, to mitigate their concerns about security of energy or supply chain.
As the vast diversity of exhibitors and visitors to this year's The Smarter E-Expo shows, powering our future through renewables is of global interest. Natalie Carney, CGTN in Munich.
Finally, football, and you might have thought it was impossible to improve on the humble pedestrian crossing, but you'd be wrong. In Frankfurt, in Germany, football fever has taken hold for Euro 2024, and the Green Man is joining in with a bit of keepy-uppy. But watch out, there's a red card for anyone trying to cross the road when the lights change. Fans of England and Denmark are in the city. The two teams currently playing each other. And by the way, the score 1-1 at half-time.
And that's it for Global Business Europe. Thanks for watching.
Coming up next on CGTN, it's Africa Live. We'll see you again tomorrow, same time, same place. From all of the team in London, it's goodbye.
Goodbye.